This video is part of the Passport.js user authentication series. If you're just now coming to this video, you haven't seen the previous ones, I've linked in the description the playlist to that series, so be sure to check it out and watch it from the beginning. Now, if you have been following along, hopefully you have gotten through some of the prerequisite videos that lead up to this video, which is going to be the start of actually implementing a Passport, specifically Passport local strategy for user authentication. My goal in this video is to get the Passport.js library imported into our Express.js application and can start to configure it. To help us with this, I've set up a repository on my GitHub that will basically give you a starter template to work from. And what this is going to do is kind of eliminate all of that stuff that we don't want to focus on, such as setting up a basic Express application, setting up a very basic database with MongoDB, and even setting up something like a Express session, which we talked about in one of the prerequisite videos for this tutorial series. In this repository, I've got 3 branches, but the master branch is going to have your starter template. So if you don't know how to use branches in Git, that's totally fine. If you do want to learn more about that, I actually have a full tutorial series on using Git. But anyways, you can see if you come into GitHub, you don't have to actually know any commands to do this. You just drop down and you can see that the different branches will have the final branch is kind of the final implementation. No promises that we'll get, line by line, character by character to the same implementation here during the video, but we'll come very close. The overall structure will be exactly the same. And then we have the final all-in-one, which is basically just one JS file or JavaScript file that has everything that you need to run this with tons of comments so that you can really figure out what is going on. So that's what the repository is. You can go ahead and fork it or clone it, whatever you want to do, and then download it to your computer. And once you've done that, you should land to a screen like the one I've got right here. And I've got open the README, which kind of gives you basic instructions on how to use it. We went through most of this already. So let's go ahead and close that out and take a quick tour of what's going on in this repository. And then we will go into the configuration of the Passport local strategy. Let's take a quick look at what I've got for you already set up in the template application. It's pretty similar to what you probably have seen before. I tried to make it a similar structure to what you might find in a lot of online Express Node.js tutorials, so hopefully this looks a little bit familiar. But anyways, we start with our app.js, which is going to set up our basic Express app. So the imports at the top, let's just go through them real quick. If you haven't installed them, after cloning the repo, just type npm install to get those installed. We have Express, pretty straightforward. Mongoose, which is the ODM for MongoDB. I will mention, while we're on this line, I've already got my MongoD service running in the background, so you'll have to do that when you're running this app. And I don't even know if I have this in the README, so maybe I will put that in here right now. We'll just say make sure to run the MongoD service before running the app locally. Alright, so now that we got that covered, just make sure that you have that running, and then you should be able to run this app just fine. Alright, so moving on, we have Express Session, which I've covered in a separate video, how this works and how to set it up. So I've already implemented it here for you. If you want to learn more about that, go to that video. Again, that is in the description. Just click on the playlist and you'll find it. So next up is Passport. This is what most of this video and the next couple videos is going to be about. We'll require in the built-in Node.js crypto library, which is going to allow us to create and verify passwords. We require in the routes, which is the routes folder. We'll get there in just a second. And also we have a database configuration in the config directory. Now coming down, we have Mongo store directly related to the Express session middleware. Again, that's another video. We have this little line right here. Most people probably have seen it, but if you haven't, all this is doing is giving us access to the .env file that we have defined over here. That by default is not going to be imported when you clone this repository because it's got secret keys in it. So you will need to create the .env file, and in the .env file, I think you only need two things. You need the DB string and the secret. And for my case, I'm just using a very simple DB string. I don't even have a user or a password, just to keep things simple for now. But in production, you'd obviously want to have a user and password in the actual database that you would connect to. So, and then the secret is going to be, I think, for the Express session module. So let's close that, and then you can see you can actually get access to those variables anywhere within this app.js file with this syntax, the process.env.variable name. All right, so moving on, we have the Express application, pretty simple. This is some middleware for parsing HTTP responses. Most of you would probably have seen app.use body parser.json, but I've just used the built-in Express parsers because I think these actually came in a little bit recently in like a recent release. I could be wrong on that, but you no longer need to use body parser. All right, session setup. Again, this was covered in a different video, but let's just take a very, very quick look at what is going on here. We have our session store, which is going to say, hey, Express session middleware, I want you to use the MongoDB database for the session storage. And in that, I want you to use the sessions table, or not table, but collection in that MongoDB database. So that's the session store. Down here in the configuration options for the session middleware, we are telling it to use that store. Then we have some other options here. So the secret, we just talked about that. That's going to help the Express session middleware validate the session that it has looked up. It's going to check to see if it matches that secret. These two options have to do with, how does the session treat or how does the session react when there's actually no changes in the browser. You can read up about that on your own. And then finally, the cookie. This is also another separate video in this series, but basically what we're doing is we're storing the session ID in a cookie in the browser, and this right here is just going to kind of tell the Express session middleware, hey, I want you to basically set an expires header, not header, but an expires property of 1 day. So this cookie will expire in 1 day, and a new session will have to be reestablished when it does expire. All right, that was just a quick overview. If you want more, you'll have to check out the other video. Next up, we have Passport authentication. I've just put in this basic require statement to show you where it is. So it's in the config directory. We'll get to that in just a moment. We are using our routes. So this is pretty standard in Express. You put your routes after the other middleware, but before your error handler. In this case, we don't have an error handler. You might want to do that for a production application. Finally, we are listening on port 3000 localhost. Pretty straightforward. So that is the basic app. Let's go ahead and look at some of the other pieces. So let me save that. We'll first start in the config. So we have passport.js. All I've done here is imported the relevant modules that we'll need to set it up. And then I've imported some database configurations, the connection, and then the user model that we'll be using. So going straight over to the database configuration, this is a pretty standard MongoDB database setup. We're requiring in Mongoose. Again, we got this access to the .env file. We're going to grab the DB string from that file, and we're going to create a connection with it. So we pass in the string to the create connection method on the Mongoose object, and then we pass in these options, which will just suppress any warning messages. Finally, we have a user schema. It's very simple. We just have a username, hash, and salt. You will see what the hash and salt mean a little bit later. So we create a model for that user based on the schema, and we export the connection so that we can use it in other files. So pretty straightforward with that. Let's see what else we've got. We have the password utils, which should just have the validate password and create password functions. So let's check that out. And you can see that I've already kind of templated out what the functions will look like. All we have to do is jump in there and actually implement them. Let's see if I'm missing anything else. Okay, I've got the routes, just one route file. And I know there's a lot of stuff in here, but really there's not much of anything. We pass in the express router, passport, because we're going to actually use passport in our routes. We have some password utils we just looked at, the database connection and user model. And really what we're going to be doing, the only thing we're going to be doing in this file is these two routes. So the login and register route, we're going to have to implement the logic behind these. In the get routes below, all I've done is create a super simple flow that we'll go through as we implement this passport authentication. So you'll see the home page is just going to tell you to please register. You'll click the link, goes to the register page, which is right here. That has just a really ugly looking form that we will type a username and password into to register. That will submit to our custom implemented post request up here. Then it will, if you're successful, it will redirect you, I think, to the login page. Then you will log in with your username and password, which will create a post request to the login post route, which we have to implement. And if you successfully log in, I think it will redirect you. We're going to have to write this logic, but it will redirect you to I believe the login success route. So it'll say you've successfully logged in. Then we'll try to visit a protected route, and that will be right here. And we're going to check if we're authenticated and let you in if you are. So basically, you can look at this, but it's just a flow of pages that we're loading. The reason I did this without using something like EJS or another templating language is just to keep it as simple as possible. All we're doing is passing basic HTML and HTML forms and using the built-in express methods like res.send and res.redirect. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, take a look at this for a few minutes, and I know it will. Before we get into the actual implementation and configuration of Passport, I wanted to show you again, I know we already touched on this in the first video just for a few minutes, but I want to show you how to find the documentation for this. I personally had a very difficult time finding kind of an end-to-end tutorial and documentation for Passport, and I think since all the strategies are developed by different developers, there's not really, a one-size-fits-all documentation for it. Now, if you go to the Passport.js website, you'll first find that you can click strategies and browse through all the different strategies. You'll be able to go to those pages. But in our case, we're using the Passport local strategy. So if we click this, we should be redirected to the Passport local strategy. It's going to give us some basic usage instructions. So we install it, we configure it with a verify function, and then we can use it in the route here, but that's pretty much all that it gives us. There's actually a couple more steps that you need to do to use the local strategy, which is kind of weird why it's not on this page. And if you click on the examples, it goes to a 404 page. I think maybe that was recent, I don't know. Whatever the case, this is actually not where you're going to want to go for documentation on the Passport local strategy. The Passport local strategy is actually better documented in the general documentation of the Passport.js middleware. So if you go to documentation right here and you click username and password, this is where you're going to get a little bit more verbose documentation on the Passport local module. So here we have the same thing, install Passport local, but here we're getting a little bit more detailed implementation of this verify callback and how you would use the form, how you would use it on the route, what kind of parameters you can pass to the verify callback. So this is a little bit better documentation, but it still kind of misses some of the configuration that you have to do for this module. So I'm going to show you exactly how to use it, but you can kind of peruse the Passport.js documentation. You'll find a few things. For example, if we click on configure, it's going to tell us how to configure a strategy because being a framework for the middleware, Passport has kind of a standardized way to integrate different strategies. So on every single strategy that we use, we're going to need a verify callback. So in this section, it kind of talks about that verify callback and what the different responses are required based on how the user, whether the user entered the correct or incorrect credentials, whether we got an error message, whatever the case, it tells you that. And then we also have documentation on the authenticate method. So Passport actually provides you with a built-in authenticate method on the Passport object, and all you need to do is provide it with the name of the strategy that you've defined, and then Passport figures out how to go find the verify callback that you've configured for that specific strategy. I know this sounds like a lot, and I know this documentation is a little bit sporadic. It's not necessarily, A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a little bit confusing. So let's just get into the implementation, and I'll do my best to kind of document the Passport local strategy for you. Like we saw in the documentation, the first thing we need to do is define the verify callback for the Passport local strategy. So we'll do this in the Passport config file, and all we need to do is comment this out, the passport.use method, and pass in the strategy and the verify callback. So I'm just going to paste in the full thing real quick, and you'll see that this looks pretty similar to what we saw in the documentation. It's also going to be pretty similar to what you'll see in a lot of tutorials. But I personally find this a bit confusing when we're looking at it all at once. So let's go ahead and deconstruct what's going on in this configuration, put it in some variables so that we know exactly what's going on. Alright, so the first thing that we need to do is define the strategy itself. So let's say strategy equals and then in this case it's going to be the new local strategy. All right, so that is the most basic way to create a strategy, and then this strategy is going to require that verify callback. So let's define that above here. And the verify callback is going to take a couple parameters. It's going to take a username, password, and done function. In this case down here I just called it callback, but it doesn't really matter what you call this. All you need to know is that this represents a function that you will eventually pass the results of your authentication to. So those are the parameters, and they will actually be populated by the Passport framework based on how you implement this. So we expect the username to be the value that we received from the request body of some sort of login form. So if we were to create a login form, type in our username and password, and then make a post request to the Express API, that post request is going to have a username and password field, and Passport is going to automatically look for those two fields and grab the values of them and populate them in the verify callback. Now there's a little bit tricky part to this, because if you don't name your username and password fields exactly this, username and password, the Passport framework is not going to, or not the Passport framework, but the Passport local strategy is not going to know what variable to look for. So in order to prevent this, we can actually define custom fields that we want Passport to look in. I'll show you how to include this in a few seconds, but first let's just get it in a variable. So we'll say custom fields is equal to an object, and we'll say the username field is going to be uname. We're just making this up, making it custom so that we can see exactly how this works. So our username field is uname, and then our password field is just going to be something like PW. So obviously these are some non-conventional ways to name the password and username fields, but if we define them in our custom fields object, then Passport local will know where to look. Alright, so we'll use that object in just a second, but first let's come back to the verify callback. So in the verify callback, what we're doing is basically our own implementation of a password verification. Now this is where I think people get tripped up a little bit. I know I did, thinking that the verify callback has to be a very specific structure and we have to use a certain database, because of course the documentation online shows that we're using the MongoDB database, but in reality it doesn't matter what database you use, and it really doesn't matter how you choose to verify the credentials. All that matters is that the return values that you pass to this done callback are what Passport expects. So we can come in here and do whatever we want, but for simplicity, as we know, I'm using the MongoDB database, so it's going to look pretty similar to what you saw in some of the examples. So let's go ahead and copy this. So I think we're done here with this copy paste, and then we can put it right here, and all we're doing is going to the MongoDB database, and we're looking for a user that has the username provided in this parameter. So again, what's going to happen, we make a post request and we provide a JSON body with uname and password. Then Passport as a middleware is going to look for these two fields, finds them, takes the value and populates these two parameters with those two values. So at this time, when we're executing this callback, These represent the username and password, so we can look up the username in the database, and then just in a basic promise, we are returning the user. So we check if there's a user in the database, if someone has actually registered already, then, or actually it's the opposite. If there's not a user in the database, then we are just going to return, this should be updated to done to represent this done callback up here. And what we're telling Passport here is that no, there was not an error in this operation, but there was also not a user. So go ahead and reject this, and so Passport will return, I believe it's a 401 unauthorized HTTP status. So that's the first check we need to do. Then we need to check whether this is valid. Sorry for all these comments. I had them in here before when I was writing this out. So we have a variable here that says is valid. And for right now, we don't know how this works. And this is not even a function that we've defined yet. But basically what we're doing, we can comment this out for, well, let's not comment it out yet. What we're doing is we're putting the password through some sort of verification function, which is going to, or we're also putting the hash and the salt stored in the user record in the database, and we're verifying those two things against the password. You'll see how that works in a minute, but basically let's just assume that this returns true or false, which it does, and we say if the password, if the login credentials are valid, then we're going to return the callback. Let me update this real quick. Again, these are just corresponding to this parameter that Passport provides. We're going to say nope, there was no error, and yep, there was a user, and this user was successfully authenticated based on my verification function. So when we pass this to Passport, it's going to let us into the route. And then finally, if it's not valid, we say nope, there was no error, but we did not verify this user correctly. Don't let them in the route. And then finally, we, using the promise syntax, we're just going to catch any of the errors that happen within the Express application, maybe on the database side of things. And if we get an error, we're just going to pass that to Passport, and it knows how to handle that. So that is the basic verify callback, and I'll show you really quickly what is actually going to happen here when we use it in a route. So let me save that and come back to one of our routes. So let's go down to the post login route. So what we're going to do is include a middleware in the post login route called passport.authenticate, and then in the authenticate we're going to say the local strategy, and we're going to pass in well, we can worry about the rest of this a little bit later. All I wanted to show you here is that we're passing this middleware in the login post route. And so basically what's going to happen is we make a post request to login with our username and password, and then that gets intercepted by the Passport middleware, and then we come in, Passport populates these two objects, it runs this function, so we're looking up the user in the database, validating the credentials, returning some sort of response. And if we get this response right here, where we populate a user, then it's going to go to the next part of this function, and it lets us in the route. So that is the basic implementation of Passport, and now we're going to tie up some loose ends and make sure that it actually works, and then we'll see it run live. We just have a few more things we have to do to get this working. The first thing I forgot to do when we finish this up is actually complete this verify callback. So we started with passport.use, and then we passed in all of this stuff. So we need to actually do this now. So the first thing that we need to do is, let's see, we have our custom fields and our verify callback. So in our new local strategy, we're going to pass in our custom fields and our verify callback. And then we're going to say passport.use, and then we're going to pass it in that local strategy. So now we actually have it configured, and in app.js, when we require it in somewhere, let's see, where do we do this? Right here in the passport authentication, we require in the configuration, and what that's going to do is basically just take this line right here and include it in the app.js. Now that we've got our strategy configured, we've done the bulk of the work. There are a few extra things that we're going to have to put in here, but I'm going to go ahead and just copy them in, and then we're going to come back to them a little bit later after we have everything working to understand them a little bit better. So at the bottom of this configuration, I'm just going to paste in two initializations, and this is the passport.serialize user and deserialize user. Now this has to do with the express session and how we put a user into the session and grab a user out of the session. Basically what is happening is we're going to put the user ID into the session, and then we're going to, when we want the user to come out of the session, we will grab that user ID that was stored there and find it in the database. Again, we're going to come back to this, so don't worry about it if you don't understand it. I think these two functions are a little bit tricky, especially because there's not a whole lot of documentation around them. So let's save that. Let me save this real quick. Let's come back to app.js and add in our last two lines that we're going to need before all of this is going to work. So right after we require in the passport configuration, we're going to say app.use passport.initialize. And again, what this is going to do is kind of initialize the passport middleware, and basically so that it doesn't get stale. So we might be using different routes. We might click to several different routes, and if we don't reinitialize the passport middleware, then there's a chance that, hey, maybe the user, maybe their session expired or something in the time that we're doing that. It's just always safe to refresh the passport middleware every single time that we load a route. And so that's what this is doing. And then we need to put in passport.session, which has to do a little bit with what we just talked about, the serialize and deserialize user, but more so it has to do with the actual express session middleware. So I know we talked about this a little bit earlier. We also talked about it in a separate video, but the express session gives us access to the request.session object, and anything that we store on the request.session object inside any of the routes is going to be persisted to the database under the sessions collection. So knowing this, Passport cleverly kind of plugs into that and bootstraps off it and uses it as a user authentication mechanism. So we're going to actually go through this along with the serialize and deserialize user in a few minutes, but for now let's see if we've got this working. We still have a few things to do in the routes before it's going to work, but let's save it and actually run the app. I'm going to run this with nodemon, so we have live updates. So nodemon app.js, and doesn't look like we have any errors at the moment, so there's a chance that we have this working. The first thing that we're going to have to do before the Passport middleware is going to be effective is finish defining the password verification and generation functions. So if you remember in the Passport configuration, in this verify callback that we had defined, we called this method called valid password. But in this module, we haven't actually created this valid password function, so it's not going to work as it stands right now. We're going to have to go over to our password utils file and define both the valid password and the gen password functions before anything's going to work. We're going to open up password utils in the lib folder, and you'll see that I have basically templated out the two functions that we're going to need. But to understand this, I've actually put a slide together so that you can visualize what's actually happening with the generate and validate password functions. We're going to be using the Node.js crypto library to do this, but before we get into the actual what methods we're using, it's better to have a conceptual understanding. On the screen right now is a basic representation of how we generate and validate a password to a database. Now, the cardinal rule here is that you're never going to store a plain text password in a database. That's kind of web application 101. I think everyone is pretty familiar with that, but actually figuring out how to do that is a little bit more complicated. Now, we talked about earlier how the Passport.js middleware does not give you a specific way that you need to do this. It gives you a lot of freedom as to how you might generate and validate the passwords that the users are providing in the login and register forms. As we go through this, just note that this is not the only way that you can go through this process. There are other libraries other than the Node.js built-in crypto library. There's also different types of logic that you can go through, but I've tried to keep it as standard as possible and kind of in line with what you would call best practice. So anyways, what's going on here is we have two steps in the process. So we have the creation of the password and the verification of the password. You can think of this as the register and the login. So you're sitting there behind your computer, you found this cool new web app, and the first thing that the web app is going to ask you to do is register. You need to give them a username and a password, and then maybe a couple other things like an email, first, last name, maybe even an address or something. But what's important is that you are providing that web app with a plain text password. You're just typing that into a field, and when the web app receives that password, it is still in plain text form. We can't really avoid that, that's fine, but what happens is we need to transform that into something that we can actually store securely in the database without worrying about some hacker, taking over a database and grabbing all the users' passwords in that database. Once the user information is stored in the database, we can move on to step 2, which is password verification. Now in step 2, you can think of this as the login process. So when the user sits behind their computer and is typing in their username and password to log into your web app, that's going to be the verification step, and what's going to happen is they're going to provide you with their username, which you're going to take and you're going to look up that user in your database using the username or maybe an email. Once you find that user in the database, then you're going to have access to this password hash and the salt that we stored before. So you're going to pull both of those values out, and along with the password, the plain text password that the user just provided you, you're going to put those values through the same exact hash function. So you pull the salt out of the database from that user, and you put in the plain text password that they just typed in. And so in this case, we have the same exact values for these parameters as we did when we created the hash in the beginning. And we know, since a hash function is always going to give you the same exact value if you put the same parameters into it, we know that we can generate a password hash and compare it to the hash that we stored in the user record in the database. And if those two values match, then we know that we have validated this user and that they have entered the correct credentials. We've got a conceptual understanding of this process, so let's go ahead and code it. We're going to come back to VS Code. Again, I've set up the functions in the parameters that they require right here. And we're going to start with the generate password function, which is the step one of the process. So this password argument is going to come from the user when they type their password into the register form. And then here is our implementation. Now I'm going to walk you through this. We're using the Node.js crypto library. And the first thing that we're going to do with that is generate a salt, which is just a pseudo-random value, and it's going to add a bit of randomness to our generation of the hash. So we have the salt, then we pass in the plain text password and that salt to the pbkdf2 method on the crypto library. And then this last part, sync, just means synchronous for synchronous operation. And then the 10,000 right here is going to represent how many iterations we're doing. 64 is how long or how big this hash is going to be. And then right here we specify which hashing function we're going to use. Finally, we will convert this to a hexadecimal string. Now down here we just return those two values and we're done with this piece of the implementation. To learn a little bit more about what we just did, I'm going to pull up a document on Google. This is from the Internet Engineering Task Force, and it's just basically a specification for different cryptography methods or password-based cryptography methods. And if we go down to the table of contents, we can actually find the pbkdf2 specification, which is what we were using from the Node.js crypto library. And you'll see that this is actually going to, well, we might actually be in the wrong spot here. We're in the appendix. Let's see if we can get somewhere a little bit more straightforward. Oh, okay, we clicked on the wrong one here. So we need to click on 5.2. And this is going to show you kind of the template for implementing that kind of function. So the Node.js crypto library is just implementing this standard right here. And we can actually come up and see some information about it. So I think there's something on iteration count. It says that they recommend at least 1,000. We put in, well, you want to have 10 million for a super secure implementation. We are somewhere in the middle with 10,000, which should be fine. And then it also talks a little bit about the salt up here, and you can read up about what that actually is. A lot of this is just math, so I don't want to get into it, but this is kind of where the standard comes from. So we're not just using some random crypto function. This is kind of what the Internet Engineering Task Force has designated as this is how you should do it when you are verifying and generating passwords. We can now come back and do the second function, which is the valid password. I'm not really sure why I called it valid password. Probably should be validate password. But anyways, here is the implementation for that. All we're doing, this is basically the same exact thing. Remember what we went through on the slide. We're just creating the same exact hash that we did up here, except this time we're receiving the hash and the salt, or well, we're just passing the salt, but we're getting that salt from the user record in the database. And then we're getting this password when the user types it in the login form. So given the same inputs, we should expect the same output, and therefore we are going to return whether the hash that comes from the database is equal to the hash that we computed using the password that the user just provided us in the salt that was in the database for that user record. So we're going to either receive true or false, and this is what we're going to put in our passport.js verify callback. So let's save this, and come back to our passport.js configuration. And you'll see that we're already using this right here. We've already set it up how we want to. We just need to import it. So I'll do that right now. So we'll say valid password equals require lib password utils dot valid password, because we've exported them here at the bottom. So now our passport.js implementation is complete, and it should work with our application once we implement the 2 post routes for login and register. So let's do that right now. We'll come to the routes, and you'll see that we have the login and register routes. They're not implemented yet, so we need to do that. It's pretty simple, so I'm just going to paste in the implementation. Most of this is just creating a user record in the database, but we're also going to be implementing that first part, the gen password function, in this register route. I think I have it. Yep, I have this already imported, but let's go ahead and rename it. We'll just say gen password to stay consistent, and then we need to grab the gen password function off of the import. So now that we have that, we can implement this. So here's the implementation. We'll walk through it really quickly. I want to point out a few things before we get started. We are grabbing the password and username values from the request.body.pw and uname fields. If you remember from the passport configuration, just to demonstrate the options you can do, we went ahead and customized what we're expecting to see from that request.body object. So we need to stay consistent, and we need to use those to grab those values. So you can see what we're doing here is we are generating that salt hash object. So it's just an object with the salt and the hash. So this one right here. And that's coming from the gen password function that we just imported up here from the password utils. Then we are going to create a new user object for the database. We're going to save that user. We'll go ahead and just console log it to the terminal, and then we are going to redirect to the login route. All right, so we have implemented register, and we can go ahead and try that out in the browser. So let's run it, run the application. Looks like we don't have any errors, so let's jump back to the browser, type in localhost 3000 /register, or actually we can just go to the home page and it gives us a link to the register. We're going to enter our username and our password. I'll just do 123 to keep it simple, and we'll submit. It looks like it properly did something. Let's come back to the terminal to verify that. Good news, we see the object that we just created. We put the username in there, and then the hash and the salt that we got from the gen password function. And then we can also check the database. So let me just open the Mongo shell and we'll look it up. So show databases. We are using the tutorial DB based on the .env file. So I will say use tutorial DB, and then we can say db.users.find, and you should see the user that we just created. So clearly we've got the user in the database, and the last thing that we need to do in this entire flow is implement the login route. So if we come back to, well, we're already in the file, we have the login route that we've already kind of put this passport.authenticate method in a little bit earlier, but I just want to add a few things to it, and we'll actually simplify this a little bit as well. The first thing I'm going to do is pass in a second argument to the authenticate method, and this is just going to be an object that tells Passport where to redirect based on the status of the login. So if you remember, the passport.authenticate method is literally just going to look in the passport configuration for this verify callback, and it's going to call this function right here. And this is going to return either a user if we are validating the user correctly and the user has provided the correct password, or we're going to say false, and in that case it's going to redirect to the login failure. So really, since we're adding conditions for both a success and a failure, we don't need this last function right here. So we've just included this normal callback that we see in most express routes, but we don't need that in this implementation, and we are pretty much done with the login post request. So let's save this and give it a try in the browser. We'll type in the same user that I did earlier, 123 for the password, and submit. And it says that we have successfully logged in. So something worked here. Now we can go to the protected route. It says you are authenticated. We can log out and reload. Now we're not authenticated, and we can log in again. So we can just go in this circle here. It's kind of how I set it up so that we can see that flow. But I'm going to be talking a lot more about how this is actually working and how you can use the Passport middleware in your routes in the next video. But let's come back one more time to the code and just kind of take a look at the routes that we just went through. So we started at login. Login submitted the data that we put in there, and the passport verify callback was called. We successfully validated the user, so we got to right here, and then we come to the route, the login post route, and we had a success. So we are going to come to the login success route. You can see the success redirect, login success. So we'll come down here somewhere. So we came to the login success. Then it said go to the protected route. So we clicked that link and we came right here, which you'll see a little bit of extra syntax. We're going to go through this in the next video, but this is how we would authenticate the user once we've run through that authentication flow in the login post route. And then we can also log out. So we've got a logout method on the request object, and then the cycle kind of repeats. We are officially done with the passport configuration. We've got it working completely, and this is all you're going to have to do for the passport local strategy to authenticate users into your web app. Now, I did mention earlier that we were going to come back to something, and it was in the passport configuration here at the bottom. So these two methods, the passport.serialize and deserialize, and then also I think in app.js, we have these two lines, the initialize and session. Now, we don't really know how those are working, and I promise that we'll come back and explain how those are working and kind of see it for ourselves in code. I would also like to go through some of these things like request.logout and request.isAuthenticated and understand what is going on there, and also kind of understand, you would intuitively think, well, we're probably just going to use the passport.authenticate middleware on every single route that we want to authenticate, but that's not the case for the passport local strategy. So if you're interested in learning more about how all of this works, I'm going to cover that in the very next video. If you enjoyed this one, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.